You know what? I'm going to stop the recording and start again. Good morning, everybody. I'm Love Coach Scott Catamas, and I'm here with TJ Woodward. And we are both going to be talking about spiritual solutions to some of the most challenging issues of our times: addiction, depression. And we are going to be sharing time with a pre-recorded interview that I did with Reverend Michael Beckwith, who is a good friend of TJ's and someone that I've had the good fortune to know for almost 40 years now. We go way back. And so the three of us are going to be conversing about this. The Reverend Michael part is part of a pre-recorded interview I did with him about 3 weeks ago. But I want to introduce TJ. Now, many of you know him already because he's been on several of the shows that I do, Straight Talk, Saturday Night Live. He is the founder, creator, and the man behind Conscious Recovery. And he's also been my coach. And I'm snobby about coaches because I train coaches. But TJ has just got this wonderful balance of wonderful wisdom and a big heart and a lot of compassion. So good morning, TJ.
Good morning, Scott, and thank you for that. You know, I'm reflecting on that you've known Michael so long and how incredible that is. Good for you. That's so wonderful. And I think you were involved, at least in some way, in the early agape days. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, literally, we were meeting in the basement of the Santa Monica Miramar Hotel on metal folding chairs, like 15, 20 people. And he was kind of like this guy who had a vision and an idea. And it's been amazing watching his remarkable evolution. And as you know, he's the real deal.
He is the real deal. Yeah. And to say a word about that, I know that when we were together in our last show, I said that I have, obviously the honor of being Michael's friend and also have collaborated with him. I was ordained by him at Agape. And, you and I, Scott, we get to meet a lot of people, right? A lot of the thought leaders in the world today. And sometimes when the camera's off and the spotlight's not on, we see a different person come through. But with Michael Beckwith, he is the real deal. He's the same if I'm having lunch with him and no one's watching, or if he's recording a show. So the reason I say that is he's someone who deeply, deeply, deeply practices spiritual principles. And as you said, he is someone that has had a big vision for his life and his life that then would impact others. And I think really that's what all of us are here to do, is be of maximum service in the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a famous phrase, never meet the author, right?
Right.
Meaning that, sometimes we meet the author and it can be very discouraging, right? They're not who we thought they would be or who we wanted them to be.
Right.
But I gotta say, because I've met a lot of authors, when I've been doing previously my television shows and now the shows that I do online, most of my favorite authors I meet, and most of them are really actually quite beautiful, quite remarkable, and Michael is right at the top of it. So the reason we're talking about this is we're going to be playing, we're going to play a little bit, stop, talk about it. We really want to converse with you, our audience. And so for those of you in our Zoom room, and we love people coming to our Zoom room, definitely thoughts, comments, questions. But likewise, I'll also be checking what's going on our Facebook pages. So if you're watching on Facebook, you can do that. I also want to acknowledge all of you who are watching the replay. The majority of people who watch this show watch the replay. And I still go back and I take a look at comments that come in from, a day from now, a week from now. So feel free to comment and we'll do our best to get back to you. All right. TJ, before we start with Michael, tell us a little bit about conscious recovery and your approach to the issues of addiction, alcoholism, etc.
Yeah. And, this show's topic really sums up conscious recovery, and that is offering a spiritual solution to these issues, whether it's a mental health issue, addiction, and conscious recovery at the root, the foundational principle. And I always start with this because once we have this foundation, then everything else is really different than some of the ways addiction has been viewed and how it's been treated in the past. So the foundational principle of conscious recovery is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that is whole and perfect. And so starting with that, which to me is very much a spiritual statement, because I was reflecting on this earlier, because I was reflecting on this idea of whole and perfect. And I have had a couple of people hear me say, oh, well, I'm perfect the way I am, so I don't need to bother changing anything. And so that's really actually not at all what I'm saying, but there's a huge difference between blame and accountability, or self-awareness and self-criticism. And so when we look at the whole and perfect piece, we're talking about our spiritual essence or our true nature. And if those spiritual words aren't something that really work for you, we can say, you know, your true self, you came into this world, this little beautiful being of light, and then we were programmed to believe all sorts of things about ourselves and the world. And so starting with this foundation of wholeness and perfection actually facilitates more change. It doesn't actually prevent us from changing. When I understand that the behaviors that I have had that have caused harm in the world, and I assure you there have been plenty in my life, they've always been because I separated from my true nature and I started to believe that I was broken, that I was damaged, or that there wasn't enough in the world, so I had to grab more than my share, etc. So starting with that foundational principle in conscious recovery, then we can from there start to address the underlying root causes, which we identify as unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. So that's kind of the conscious recovery 101. Obviously, I could talk for hours about that, but that's really those are the basic core tenets of conscious recovery.
You know, and I love it because it goes along so beautifully with what we teach in Love Coach Academy. People say, well, what's the difference between being a love coach and a traditional therapist? And TJ, I always say, traditional therapists, God bless them, they spend many years learning how to evaluate and diagnose what's wrong with someone.
Right.
We don't believe in love coaching that there's anything wrong with anyone.
Yeah.
No one's broken. Life's just really challenging. Life is hard, and we have unique challenges. And if we come together in compassion for how challenging life can be, and then offering specific tools and practices, all together helping each other to remember who we truly are, which is beautiful, divine, spiritual beings having a human experience. So
Yeah, and that's really important because I think life is difficult, and this is true for me. I love Byron Katie. She often will say, "I don't know if this is true for you, but this is what my experience is." So my experience has shown me that when life is difficult, because things happen in life, for whatever reason, we've come to a planet that's pretty dense in some ways. And when I say dense, there's a lot of fear here, there's a lot of competition, there's all of this that we see in the world. And when I know who I really am, then I'm not being bounced around by the conditions of the world in quite the same way or in at all. If I don't have that core connection, right? So you said it so beautifully, Scott. Recovery or spiritual growth, mental well-being, all of this is really a return to our wholeness. It's not a destination. It is a remembering. And you use that word, and I love that. And so the spiritual practices and tools at Love Coach Academy and Conscious Recovery, the similarity is in some way we're bringing ourselves back to that remembering, and that is what is different than many of the therapeutic models.
beautiful. Yes, 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 yes. I always appreciate how in alignment we are in our way of thinking and in the compassionate approach to the people that we work with.
Yeah.
I want to read the first comment that came into our Zoom room. And please, everybody, tell us your thoughts, comments, questions. From Mark, he writes, thank you for helping with the inner transformation that was inevitable after the external pandemic evolutionary change.
Hmm.
Hidden is now revealed where old patterns had to change.
Yes.
I love that, Mark, because I do believe that to a large degree, this global pandemic has been a big step towards reset.
Yeah.
Um, and, it's interesting if you take a look at human history, uh, there have been many pandemics. And when there's a big pandemic, it's always followed by a huge cultural or social change.
Yeah.
After the Black Plague, which wiped out about a third of Europe, we had the Renaissance. So and I think we all know that we all have to change. Humankind was on an unsustainable path.
Yeah.
Um, and so, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, and I love that because I'm thinking about it, that the collective experience is a reflection of the individual experience, right? And so whether it's addiction, a mental health issue, a divorce, a loss of a job, we've all gone through periods where it's difficult and something beautiful comes out of it. But and what I love about it, and this is one of the reasons I love Michael Beckwith, is he fully embraces the human experience. It's not about being oh so spiritual that we're no longer human. It's about being a human incarnation and bringing spirituality in. And so in my own transformation, there have been plenty of dark nights of the soul. And sometimes that looks like, being in the fetal position, sobbing and releasing these old patterns. But here's the thing that's interesting that you spoke to. I usually don't realize what the transformation was about until much later. So we're coming out of this global pandemic now, and we may not understand the spiritual transformation that has happened until later. Now, some of us have an idea of it. I mean, I knew immediately, oh, we're in for some transformation. And then we saw the BLM movement. We saw all kinds of things emerge where we're saying the old paradigm isn't really serving us anymore. And this is a time for us to reflect. But I don't think we're going to see the impact. Now, we could say, both positive and negative. I'm trying to not use those words as much or as often anymore. But we haven't seen the impact from a mental health and addiction standpoint yet, but also the powerful transformation. I think in the weeks, months, and years to come, we're going to see more and more of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Coming back to the gallery view, thank you, TJ. It's true. It's like I look back at kind of the big hard things in my life, and you go, "Oh my God, that was so hard. Never want to go through that again." And look at how it shaped me. Look at how and we read this over and over with most of our favorite spiritual teachers talk about this.
Yeah.
And so, speaking of spiritual teachers, I'm going to start the Michael Beckwith interview, but we're going to come in and out. We're going to periodically pause it, share, talk. I really want to respond to people's comments and hear more wisdom from TJ. But let's bring Reverend Michael Beckwith into our room here. And I better optimize the sound. We definitely want to do that. There we go. All right, here we go. Well, thank you very much. Well, we're really wanting to tackle some of the really significant challenges that our tribe is going through. Addiction, of course, domestic violence is way up. Alcoholism, addiction is way up. Suicidal fantasies and even suicide attempts are way up. And so we're wanting to address that, and that's why we wanted to ask you for your thoughts on what we can do in terms of if it's ourself, if we're challenged by these issues, and what to do when it's someone we love or care about.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're in a kind of a pressure cooker right now with the dilemma of the polarity of what's happening in the world and the crisis of fear around health and viruses and things of this particular nature. And also a kind of a lockdown. All of those things are allowing people to come face to face with themselves in an interesting way. And so, first of all, where I am concerned, I think when we are concerned, we always want to have our heart space very malleable, very very available so that we have a tremendous amount of compassion for individuals who are going through any of the things that you just mentioned, whether it's addiction, whether it's suicidal fantasies, whether it's individuals who are releasing rage and it's becoming the aegis of domestic violence. We want to hold a space of compassion for everyone that's going through any of that. And I think this whole thing that we're going through as a species right now is a call for compassion. It's a call for us to go probably deeper than we've ever gone before in terms of, what is compassion? When we understand the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion, there's an answer there. And sympathy asks the question, how do you feel? Um, Empathy says, I'll feel for you. Compassion says, how can I serve?
Mm.
How can I alleviate suffering? So we're all being invited to ask ourselves, how can we alleviate suffering? So for everyone who is not going through the aforementioned um, experiences that you mentioned, we have to keep asking ourselves, how can we be of service? How can we alleviate suffering? And if we live with that question, then we will respond appropriately, moment by moment, to the individuals in our family and to individuals that we come across. Now, the individuals that are actually going through this, if a person is going through a suicidal fantasy or has even attempted the suicide, you know, that there has to be a reminder here that life is precious and that everyone has a future. And I think that when an individual is going through this, and I've worked with people over my 40 years of teaching, I always remind them that there's a future here. There's a future. It may seem hopeless and bleak right now, but I want you to begin to think about what you can do tomorrow. And then I want you to think about what you can do the next day. I want you to think about your future. Uh, and it's counterintuitive to our mindful practices in which we're trying to stay present and trying to be in the now. But when an individual is suicidal, I want them to think about a future. You know, I want them to think about what they're going to do next week. You know, how they're going to walk in the direction of of a purpose or of something that they really, really want to experience in their life. So I generally invite people to think about a future and to write down exactly, to the best of their ability, what they are going to do with their life next week. And then that becomes kind of a to-do list that keeps them thinking in the future. And then secondly, I always want whoever I'm talking to right now, I really want you to know that though it feels like it, you're not alone. That sense of loneliness invades the life of the best people, of people who, have really looks like they have it together on the outside. Uh, there's a sense of foreboding and loneliness that takes over people's life. And I want people to come to an understanding that that sense of aloneness, or no, that sense of loneliness can give way to a sense of aloneness, which becomes an opening to really having an encounter with the divine, an encounter with that which you cannot see with your eyes or hear with your ears, but in a moment of crisis, when you're at your wits' end, when things of the external world just aren't working, there's a moment of sheer aloneness where suddenly in the darkness, you actually see that you're not alone. There really is a presence. I can testify to this. This is not religion, it's not a belief system, it's real that each of us are not alone. And sometimes on the precipice of a deep sense of feeling alone, there's an emergence of, oh my God, there's something here. I didn't notice it before because I was busy. I didn't notice it before because I was in my business and I was working my business. I was working my job. I was doing whatever I was doing. But since I can't do that anymore because everything seems to be, I seem to be cut adrift from my normal activities, if we can just sit with the awareness, I have a future, I'm not alone. We can even say that to ourselves. I have a future, I'm not alone.
Come back to TJ for a moment, because just both of those pieces are so strong. I have a future and I'm not alone.
Yeah, and as Michael so beautifully stated, that's the issue I think that would lead someone to feeling suicidal. I have in my life on 2 occasions had, you know, what we would call suicidal ideations or suicidal fantasies, as you put it. And in both of those cases, it was that I felt that no one was there for me or no one understood me. I felt alone. And I really love where Michael went with it, because it's really important through that darkness. And you know, just I like to tell my story in a transparent way, because I think it's useful for us to normalize that we've all had these experiences. Now, maybe not everyone watching has personally felt suicidal, but I have. And the one time, the only thing that kept me going was my nephew, who was a young child at the time. And there was just no way, knowing what I knew about the trauma that would provide him. And isn't that interesting? Because um, I might have felt at my darkest, but I felt like I had some purpose and I wasn't alone in that I needed to be there for him. So even that is an understanding of both of the things Michael said. I have a future. I need to be here for him, whatever that takes. And I'm not alone. I do have this one person. Now, I think the deeper important message that Michael was providing us is that through that darkness, the transformation can happen. Sometimes, and you know, you and I, Scott, already talked about this before Michael did, and that is in the darkest periods of our life, we can find transformation, right? And this is something that there's so many metaphors that would work. I've been watching this incredible show on the deep sea and how there's so many species in the deep ocean that we don't know about yet. And there are dinosaurs down there, literally 200, they're like these millions of year old sharks. And the metaphor is we have, for the most part, spent more money on going to space than going into the depths of the ocean. That is such a perfect metaphor. I personally, and I see a lot of us going up there and out there, you know, how do I, you know, attain something or reach something instead of going into the depths of the ocean and really exploring what's there. And the deepest discovery is that when I allow myself to actually go into the depth, as Michael said, and I'll repeat what he said, or at least what I heard him say, is we can then encounter this place where we realize that we're not alone. And for me, it's really because I realize I've tapped into the spiritual oneness of all life. Now, that is not a cerebral process. It's not a concept and it's not an ideology. It is an experience. Oh, I just touched reality. I just touched the reality of oneness. I just touched the reality of love. And then at that point, all of these conditions of the world have less significance. It doesn't mean they don't happen, but there's less significance.
That's a perfect segue to a question that Rolanda wrote in our Facebook group. She wrote, how can I get our son to see that his inner environment is what he is really struggling with? TJ, what are your thoughts?
I'll start with, on the surface, I'll start with, I can't get anyone to see anything. You know, just to normalize.
Oh, no!
And just that framework, the invitation is for me to recognize what my attachment is. I have never been a mother, and I can't even imagine. I have so much compassion for a mother or a father who has a child who is struggling, either with mental health, suicidality, addiction. My heart goes out to you. And so I want to be really clear. I don't have the experience, so I don't want to in any way minimize what you're going through. And to notice the language because there's probably something there. How can I get him to? So there are a couple of things, right? The old school way is you set boundaries, and the old school boundary is I'm going to set a boundary for someone else. It's really about me, right? And so if I can, because the statement was, how do I get my son to realize it's the inner life? So I start to view him that way. It's not done through language. It is starting to hold and behold the wholeness within him, and then begin to ask him questions and become curious, right? We can go deeper and talk about the quantum field. And it's very tricky with parents because I remember when I was, young adult teenager, my mom would just look at me and I would just get furious and she didn't do anything. It's because there was some unresolved stuff from much earlier in life. And, we talked about this in the last show. Blame is a very low frequency. And oh, is it seductive? I want to blame myself or I want to blame someone else. And when I talk with mothers specifically, the conversation inevitably at one point goes to self-criticism or self-blame. Did I do something to create this in my child? And so there's this really delicate balance of not going into blame, but being accountable. I don't mean being accountable for the damage you caused your son, but to recognize that we're in this relationship. And again, knowing what I know about what a child really needs, I don't know if it's possible to do that every single moment, to be present, to be open, to be there, to allow them to have their feelings. Most of us, have work or we're driving around, we're taking kids to soccer, and sometimes we lose our temper. And sometimes, I've had a couple of things with my nephew. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that or did that. Right. So healing comes in this moment. And really, really healing is about returning to wholeness. Return to wholeness in this moment, start to see that he is a whole and perfect spiritual being. And then from there, there's a frequency or an energy that can get created where I can start to ask questions about his inner life.
Beautiful. I totally agree with all that. And two other thoughts that came to my mind, and then we'll get back to Michael.
Yeah.
Remember that it's part of every adolescent's nature to break away from their parents, and especially for a son breaking away from his mother or a daughter breaking away from her father, because for most of us, the first love of our life is our parents, and especially the parents of the opposite gender. And then at a certain point, we have to break away from that so that we can interact and have relationships with our peer group. And so for most teenagers, especially teenage boys, breaking away from the mother is a whole thing, because there's that age where you still really want your mother's love and approval, but you also have to, you're exploring autonomy and independence and freedom of choice, and you need to break away. And there's that push-pull, especially usually through a few tender years of adolescence. So it's really important during those years to give a lot of space. Let the son or let the child know, let the teenager know, I'm always there for you when you want me to. And you have as much freedom as you need, as long as there's safety. And it's a delicate balance. And as TJ said, it's all we can do is imagine. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we ask questions, especially the teenagers, it almost always is experienced as prosecutorial. Even if we're being curious, they hear it as the prosecuting attorney asking us, well, why did we, and then they get even more defensive. So it's, I think, coming to the specific question, how to get him to understand, and I love what TJ said, let's look at what it is you're wanting, but learn by example. So demonstrate it. Demonstrate, wow, I noticed that when I get really triggered, it's because, I noticed that it's my abandonment wound or my fear of this or my fear of that, which is driving me to behave in such a way. And so you may not even have the conversation about it, but if your son watches how you self-reflect, how you take personal responsibility, how you look at your inner world as the reason or the why you are reacting to your outer world, that's the best way. Because he's smart. He's gonna watch what you're doing, and then he doesn't have to rebel against it, right? If you if you teach it or present it, there may be a natural teenage reaction to rebel against it. But if he watches how you do it without there even being conversation, it's like, oh, okay. So those are my thoughts, and now I'll come back to TJ, and we'll go to Michael.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. That is absolutely right. And for me, it's also what I alluded to, and that is it's really energy, and we're all really aware of it. And if I'm holding a space of criticism or judgment, it is felt. And again, compassion, compassion, compassion. I have for mothers and fathers that are walking through this, and ultimately, it is about what's getting touched within me and how do I heal that. And I really love what Scott said about demonstrating rather than asking, because you are so right. And we're assuming this person, the son, is a teenager. He might not be. I've worked with young adults, and I will say for myself, when I was in my 20s, I was still pretty much a teenager in a lot of ways.
I still am. I'm 65 and I'm still a very active teenager. All right, let's go back to Reverend Michael, and thank you, Chris and Sheila from Santa Monica, for your thoughts and your prayers and your comments. Really appreciated that. All right, let's go back to Reverend Michael for a bit.
And then from there, we begin to sneak up on the fact that each being on the planet does have a purpose. There aren't any extra people. I don't care what the people say about overpopulation. There aren't any extra people. There aren't any mistakes. There aren't any do-overs from the present. Every being is necessary. Every being is meaningful to the unfoldment of what's trying to happen here. And if we can sneak up on the fact that everyone has a purpose, and the purpose that everyone has on the meta level is to reveal the cosmos or the presence in a way that has never happened before, because we're unique beings, you see. So the aloneness gives way to, there's something here that I haven't been paying attention to, you see. And then I do have a future. And then I matter. I'm significant. I'm not an accident. I have a purpose. So if we ask, if an individual is in the throes of a suicidal tendency, I'm not alone. Sit with that. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. I have a future. I do have a future. And I do have a purpose. If we lean into that, little by little by little, there would dawn on our awareness. We will catch the sweet whispering of life, beckoning us back to ourselves. And oftentimes in our darkest hour, and I don't speak from someone sitting on an ivory tower. I can remember a number of years ago where something had happened in my life. And I remember the suicidal thoughts went through my awareness, you know. And then I thought about my parents. I thought about, how that would affect everyone. And I came back to myself, So I'm not speaking from, some clinical, psychological training. I'm speaking from my own life and then my own awareness of the presence that's never an absence. So if one can just kind of contemplate that. And then fourth, if you're in the throes of something like that, please, please, please reach out to anyone. Anyone. Even if they think you're crazy, just reach out and say, I need some help. I'm having trouble here. Talk to me for a moment, you see.
That is so important, reaching out to someone for help. And I know as a coach, you've experienced it. As a coach, I've experienced it, where I've had people call me up and say, Scott, I want to end it. I'm done. I'm done. And I actually be curious. I don't think you and I have ever had this conversation, teacher. So I'm curious the approach I take. It's a little radical. With clients and friends that I have that have suicidal fantasies, I make an agreement with them. If you're really having that thought, that fantasy, please call me. I promise you, I won't call the police. I won't report you. I won't actively try to stop you, but I will absolutely want to talk with you.
Mm.
And I have found that that really helps, because there are some people that are afraid to call because they don't want to have the police called or the hospital called or whatever. And some people, even that ego part of them, if they're really like, no, I want to do it. If they think that you're going to absolutely immediately go into, no, you can't, then it's not safe. But by establishing, hey, I just want to talk about it, let's just talk before you do it. It creates a safety. And I've had multiple people call me, and they were pretty close. And sometimes they just were lonely. And sometimes they really were on the edge. So that's actually the approach I've taken. And curious your thoughts about what Michael said or what I just said.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's a nuanced conversation because, as a mandated reporter, I ultimately do have to report someone if they tell me they're suicidals. And it's tricky because what I hear you saying is where I come from. I remember, when I worked full time in residential treatment, when a client would want to leave because it was just becoming too painful for them, something was coming up that they didn't feel they were equipped to handle, and they projected it outward and they said, I have to leave. I would always start with, I'm not here to convince you to stay.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with this in my experience, because someone that is at that place will want to be heard. Now, they may not realize that. And so if I come from, because I have said to myself and to clients, it's a valid choice if that's what you choose. Right. And that takes away, and that could be radical, right? That could be seen as radical. And the reason I say that, first of all, is there is no death, really, right? So spiritually, I can feel comfortable saying that. But the deeper purpose of that statement is to have them understand that it's a safe place for them to actually share what's happening. And there's something really powerful that happens when I move into openness with them, instead of like, oh gosh, I've got to convince this person they shouldn't do it. And
Yes.
it's a felt sense that they have, and that is true with someone who comes to me and says, I've been in recovery for 3 years and I really want to want to drink and use drugs. I start with saying, I'm not going to try to convince you not to. So let's just have a conversation here. Right. So we're really talking about what it truly means to hold space instead of judgment, because judgment is an energy of constriction or restriction, and curiosity is a place of openness. And then that allows the person, hopefully, a little space to have the experience that Reverend Michael's talking about, that's so important, to reach that place where we understand, oh, I do have a purpose here. I do have a purpose. I am part of this this humanity, and I've incarnated here, and that's not by accident.
Mhm.
Right now, I'm not going to probably say that specifically to a person who is struggling. A wise person once said, "Nothing could be truer or less useful." Right, and that is also, trying to convince someone to stay on the planet. When I'm in that energy of, oh my gosh, that this can't happen, and I've got to convince them otherwise, there's an energy there, and they feel that, right? So if I say, wow, I understand that might be a valid choice, let's talk about what's happening for you. I feel and I believe and I have experienced, when I touch that deeper truth, I don't want to leave the planet. And how many times have we heard someone that survives a suicide, at the moment when they do it, they realize they don't really want to do it? So how do we become curious? And that requires a lot of inner, we could call it work, but inner presence with myself. Because if I haven't healed, or if I'm not really in a space of wholeness myself, I'm going to really want to manage them. Right. So there's a valuable lesson there for us, the observer, as well.
It's a beautiful point. Uh, 4 simple words: never convince, invite connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like for those of us who we want to convince, right? Put it on Post-its everywhere, because it doesn't work to try and convince somebody, but it does work to invite connection.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the great teaching of Marshall Rosenberg. So thank you, Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about, wow. And noticing, wow, when am I trying to convince TJ? When I'm trying to convince my son or my mother or my daughter or my lover? Wow, okay. Instead, just invite connection. And the best way to invite connection is not by talking, but by listening. Yeah. So, all right, back to Reverend Michael. I'm loving this, by the way. This is really fun, kind of doing this with you. Thank you, TJ.
Me too.
I think if we move to those 4 dynamics, it goes a long way towards the prevention of crossing a line that one cannot cross. You know, I know you probably want to ask me another question, but what just came to my mind is, you know, at the Golden Gate Bridge, where people sometimes are prone to leap off and try to commit suicide. I was reading an article where, there's a boat there. There are people that work at some of these places, and they try to save people that jump over. And this particular gentleman that was his job, he said that everyone that he saved, they all said the same thing, that on the way down, they said to themselves, this was a bad idea. This was a bad idea. Why am I doing this? And they survived, to be able to say that. So anyone who's in the throes of that, understand that's not your real self speaking. That's the disappointment speaking. That's the part of you that think it's really lost something that can never regain speaking. That's the part of you that's probably been hurt that's speaking. But the real you can heal and get over anything with a little help. Yeah.
Beautiful. 2 things came to mind. One is just I've heard that we shift from the perception of being alone to the perception of all one.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what you were referencing.
Yeah. Aloneness is all oneness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what happens is people, we're in what I've called over the years, I've called it a high tech, but sometimes a low touch society.
Mm.
And that's increased with the advent of more technology. It's been very high tech, but low touch.
Yeah.
And with the advent of that, the sense of loneliness has increased, even though people are chatting and doing things on Facebook and Instagram and all of that. The sense of connection has diminished. So that what we're inviting ourselves to do is to come back to what you just said, that sense of aloneness. Where I was leading was that everything has been so busy, but we get to that sense of, we pierce the veil of loneliness, and we come to be just being alone. Just being alone, and being alone is sweet. It's wonderful. Your connection with yourself. You look at your own thoughts. You can see, is that thought worthy of me? Is that an inspirational thought? Or is that a thought that's coming out of a sense of loss? You can actually look at all of that and then choose again. But it's very difficult to do that when you're all in the busyness of life. But when you're alone, you get to the point where, oh, I'm not alone, and I'm all one with the one. You see? Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Well, that's a good spot for us to come in for a moment. And one thing I've noticed about people that are uncomfortable being alone it's one thing to be alone in your home, in your apartment. It's another thing to be alone in nature. And so I found for myself, and certainly I recommend to clients, if being alone in your place, in your home, your apartment is uncomfortable, go do alone time in nature. Because there's something about being in nature that we can focus on the beauty of nature, but if we're still by ourselves, we're not with another human being, maybe with the dogs. I love to be in nature with my dogs. Um, it's a good time to it's a good place to self-reflect. It's a good place to drop into, okay, what's really going on with me? What's really going on in my relationship? Why am I doing whatever it is I'm doing that I want to change? So I just wanted to add that piece and love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so beautiful. And I love that there's one mind that Michael, spoke about the people jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and we had just spoken about that. And I
Yes.
love that synchronicity. And what Michael's really speaking to, and Scott, what you are speaking to as well, as really ultimately we become the observer.
Mm,
He talked about a recognition that the collection, he didn't say this exactly, so this is how I interpret it, a collection of stories, ideas, and beliefs. When we understand that's not who and what we are, and when we tap into that alone, all one, that all oneness that we've talked about, then we become the observer, and then we can start to look at, and I love that Michael said, is this thought worthy of me? Like, let's
mm,
take a moment with that. Is this thought worthy of me? Is this thought an inspiration? One of the things about social media, and he alluded to this and spoke to it so beautifully, is that we end up often putting out an image on social media. And so we're not, in many ways, we're not as connected. And that's really what we all desire, love and connection. At the root of it, we all want love and connection. Now, that may be buried under years of trauma and strategy where it looks like I don't want you to connect. But I really know that underneath the deepest level, we all want love and connection. And if I'm comparing myself to someone's, what is it? I'm comparing myself to someone's greatest hits rather than what's happening behind the scenes. I butchered that one, but we tend to, on social media, focus more on the personality self, or what we would call an ego. Nothing inherently wrong with that. When we tap into our essential beingness, we can start to observe those thoughts. And as Michael said, we can start to question every thought. I mean, for me, true freedom is being able to question absolutely everything I've ever believed to be true about myself and the world. When I say a statement like, I put out a quote that says, true awakening is unbelieving everything I've ever thought. Now that's, okay, that can be a bold statement, but in my experience, that's ultimately true.
mm. I want to thank you for that. 2 years ago, I worked with TJ and I read his book and I did his workbook. And I'm remembering as you're saying that a big part of your workbook was helping me to re-examine my thoughts and my belief systems. So it's beautiful work to do. I want to touch on something else too, which is such a big part of what makes being a human being difficult, is that we are in an illusion of separation.
Right.
It really seems like I am this body, and then there's everything else. And this body is vulnerable. The physical body is vulnerable. The emotional body is vulnerable. The mental body is vulnerable. And there's like this little tiny me in this gigantic other world that wants to hurt me.
Yeah.
Or can hurt me.
Right? Yeah, because we've been trained that we're a separate self.
Right.
And innately, there's a place within each and every one of us that understands that's not the ultimate reality. So when we talk about, because I think the mind is a tricky little playground. We think it's either this or it's that, right? So if you hear me and Scott and Michael saying, really, we're all one, but wait a minute, I have this skin, I can see that I'm a separate being. And so I think the process of life, and perhaps why we've come on planet Earth, is to recognize that there's oneness and I'm a separate being, but not really, truly, not ultimately. In relative reality, I have thoughts, I have perspectives, we have something called countries, we have something called gender, we have something called age, all of these things that get passed down, and this means that. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say, well, I'm in my 50s now, so this means this, or I'm in my 60s, and I, at very least, we want to question all of those paradigms. And so it is true that ultimately we're all part of one organism. And I think, you know, we'll look back at this time historically and say, oh, wow, there were some people pointing to it. They almost got it. That we're all part of one organism, that we're cells in one spiritual body, and really understanding that, and then honoring, yeah, so I have this skin suit, as we might call it, and I have this experience that might be uniquely me, but ultimately the true experience is the oneness, the at oneness, the all oneness that we're speaking to. And so it's really both. It's not one or the other.
You know, there's a really wonderful, talking about the time that we're living in, TJ. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I talk about it a lot, and I learned this from Deepak Chopra. About the most ancient sacred texts that have survived, that are not just sitting in the basement at the Vatican somewhere, are the ancient Vedic scriptures written in Sanskrit about 7,000 years ago. And in the Vedic scriptures, God is known as Brahman. And in the Vedic scriptures, Brahman is given 26 principles. Fast forward 7,000 years to today, and in quantum physics, now our scientists, our most sophisticated science has proven that we all are living in a unified field of ever-changing molecules. And guess what? Our scientists have determined so far that there are 26 principles of the unified field. And those 26 principles of the unified field perfectly correlate with the 26 principles of Brahman written 7,000 years ago, which means we are living in this incredible time when our most ancient sacred spiritual texts and our most modern science comes together and explains the same thing. We are not actually separate. We are in the illusion of separation. And this is all to say, in whatever way anyone listening can, cultivate your own experience of connection beyond yourself. Right? Whatever that is, through meditation, yoga, martial arts, playing a musical instrument, religion, spiritual practice, whatever it takes. It could be one-on-one or within yourself through music or through a form. Cultivate a way that you experience your connection to that which is greater than the body.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, so much. I'm also just leaning into, like, we need to do a part 2, because I want to hear. I mean, it's like it's so rich. We could, you know, we could spend an entire hour on everything you just said, Scott, because it's vitally important. Suffering comes from the belief in a separate self. That is just absolutely, for me, a very profound and yet very simple spiritual truth. And how it correlates to our conversation is, when I believe I'm a separate self, then of course there are going to be times that I feel suicidal, because this whole thing that we've constructed as a separate self no longer works. And I was talking with my friend Jeremy that I noticed that I hadn't been talking about something that I used to talk about a lot, and that is the word disillusionment. I'm disillusioned. Well, listen, really lean into that word, disillusioned. I am moving away from the illusion of separation, the illusion of scarcity, the illusion of fear. And so when we tap into ultimate reality, as we've been talking about, at this all oneness, when we tap into that, we can be really disoriented because we're growing in awareness. And yes, it's true that science and spirituality, or, you know, the way I've said it is that science is now confirming what mystics have been teaching us for thousands of years, and that is, there is one life, that we're each an expression of one life. And to really understand that is to change the nature of reality in our individual and collective experience. And so for me, it's twofold. What are the practices that help me to experience my true nature? And at the same time, that's one part of it. And the second part, as Scott said earlier, a big part of my work is questioning absolutely everything that lives in relative reality. Where did I first believe this? Where did I first have this idea what it means to be a man, to be white, to be this age, to be from America, etc.? Or where did I first question what it means to be 50 something? All of these two processes live simultaneously. And when we blend these, cultivating a relationship with the ultimate self or our true nature, and then questioning absolutely everything that lives in relative reality, we step into a completely new way of being in the world. And that's really what Jesus said, be in the world, but not of the world. So we have these master teachers that have come, and there have been many, but what's different right now is a recognition that we are all master teachers of this, that we have all come here. It's no longer for a select few. Consciousness is raising where there are each of us has the ability to recognize this and live it.
Beautiful. And yes, we have the same idea because we're only 13 minutes through a 47-minute Michael Beckwith, so we will have to do a part 2.
Yes.
And 2 quick things. We'll go back to Reverend Michael for a little bit and we'll wrap up and we'll do a part 2.
Yeah.
Whatever each of us can do to cultivate faith, to cultivate connection, so important. Like TJ, most of the people I work with as a coach are in crisis.
Yeah.
And since the death of my wife died, and so a lot of people now reach out to me and have been reaching out to me for many years when they get the diagnosis of terminal cancer for themselves or their husband or their mother or whomever. And so all day long, I'm dealing with people that are in crisis. And I want to tell you, the people that have faith or a practice, it's so much easier than the ones that don't. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's easier. It's so having a practice, having faith. For some of you, it may be establishing a new practice. For some of you, it may be going back to a practice you had that maybe you've strayed away from for whatever reasons. But cultivate a practice. Very, very important. The other thing, just to riff on something that TJ said about who we truly are. I had the good fortune many years ago, I'm 65 now. When I was in my 30s, I worked with a hypnotherapist. And I went back into early childhood and even back further. But I'll just keep it at, I discovered that so much of who I thought was me, so much of who I thought was this unique me was just childhood patterning. There were little things I'd learned when I was really little to get love from mother and love from father, and these significant personality traits that I thought were me were just, as TJ would say, brilliant strategies to get my needs met. So, you know, it's a fascinating exploration to keep questioning, to definitely keep questioning.
Yes.
Let's do one more round of Reverend Michael, one more round of Scott and TJ, and then we'll call it a Sunday. And thank you, everybody. Really appreciating your comments. So thank you very much. And let's see where Reverend Michael's going to go next. I want to ask you about kind of moving into addiction and domestic violence. Of course, it's always rooted in pain.
Yeah.
And and even suicidal fantasies is often, I just want the pain to stop. I just want the pain to stop. And then we make a desperate choice to try and stop the pain. Usually most domestic violence, they were just trying to stop the pain. And God, they had a gun or they threw a fist. So I'd just like to address your thoughts when either we are in that level of pain, or again, of course, having compassion for someone when they're in that level of pain. But especially when drugs or alcohol have become the habit, the habitual compulsion to avoid the pain.
That's right. You said something, the compulsiveness. A compulsive behavior is what we do to keep ourselves from feeling pain.
Mm-hmm.
whether it's alcohol, drugs, pharmaceutical opioids, whatever it is,
Sugar.
sugar, overeating, whatever. That's what we do to avoid the pain. And then individuals become addicts. Now, so there's two levels of addiction. There's the one we just described, and then there's the level of a person that's an addict that's trying to recreate a high they once had, you know,
Yes.
and they forget that their body is a living pharmacy that doesn't need any exogenous ingredients, doesn't need anything outside of itself to create that, to recreate that bliss that happens when you're in a state of gratitude, thanksgiving, even if you have to make it up, even if you have to make up the Thanksgiving, just make up something to be grateful for. This the chemical tonic, the tonic chemicals still flow, even if you're just making it up. You know, so there's that addiction where you're trying to recreate a high, and then there's the addiction of compulsive behavior, trying to avoid pain. And so, one, for those who are trying to recreate a high, it'll never happen. You'll never you'll never get that high again. You'll after your first hit, whether it's cocaine, whatever it is, it never happens again. You know, and your body would need more and more and more and more, obviously, to get some modicum of what you call a high. So that kind of addict needs to be reminded that they're in search of themselves.
Mm.
The elusive high is the elusive real self. And whether you hit rock bottom or whether any of these words that we say gives you an insight, begin to pursue a different path that's going to bring you to yourself. If you're trying to avoid pain, you know, in the human experience, pain is inevitable. It's inevitable. Somebody's going to die. Somebody's going to lose a job. There's going to be a downturn in the economy that's going to affect people. There's going to be breakups in relationships. Uh, no one goes through the human experience unscathed by the dynamics of death and loss or ill health. Even if it's not your ill health, maybe it's the ill health of a beloved friend. You see, so we're not gonna avoid it. You see, the idea is that we have to embrace it as an inevitable part of the human experience, but embrace it in a way that allows us to totally embrace it so that we have moments of transcendence, not avoiding, not burying it under the rug, not pretending it's not there, but it's a total embracing. So if tears need to be shed, tears can be shed. If in fact someone needs to cry, someone needs to cry. If someone needs to temporarily release energy by hitting a pillow, then someone needs to temporarily release that energy by hitting a pillow. You know, you're not going to get through human experience without the pain. We can get through the human experience without long-term suffering, because suffering is the story we tell ourselves about the pain. You see, we tell ourselves, you know, this shouldn't have happened. We go into wishful thinking. If I only would have, should have, could have, I would have done this, then this wouldn't have happened. Or if she hadn't done this, then that wouldn't have happened. We come out of wishful thinking and we get rid of the story of what could have happened and didn't happen, realize total acceptance. Whatever happened, happened. This person left me, or I had to leave this person, or I got fired, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
Total acceptance of it. And then from total acceptance, we're able to harvest lessons that we're learning. And then we're able to go into deep moments of forgiveness of ourselves and anyone else involved, so that we're not trying to run from the pain, but we're not trying to create a story around it that leads to long-term suffering. You see? And this is not, it's not playtime. This is all work.
Yeah.
You know, this is really introspection. This is real work, you know, that one has to take on. And sometimes we want to take the easy way out. We want to drink something. We want to smoke something. We want to pop a pill. We want to do something to take the easy way out, only to discover that when that stuff wears off, we're still there.
Yeah.
whatever happened still happened.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not about running from our problems. It's about embracing them, a full on feeling whatever it is we have to feel about it. And then we're alone. And in that moment of aloneness, we get a light, we get an insight, we get a, oh, this is going to pass. This is not going to be my forever. My forever is not going to be a song about how this person died or left me, or the job I lost, or the account that I lost, or the body temple that failed me. No, this is an experience. You see, again, help may be necessary. So anyone who's going through addiction, either through trying to catch the elusive high, or trying to avoid pain and making it a compulsive behavior, there's nothing that's going to satisfy until you actually open the door and be with the pain and be with whatever happened. If you made the biggest mistake in your life, that's what happened with me. Many years ago, I made a big mistake. Well, I thought it was a mistake at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm checking out. I'm getting out of here. And then it was like, no, you're not. You're not going to do this. And my life unfolded beautifully after that. But I had to make that choice, you see, to just face the consequences. Whew. Yeah.
Even Reverend Michael, right? There it is, Even Reverend Michael had that moment. And we talk more about it, but I'm going to stop the thing there. Radical acceptance. Radical acceptance. I think that's a beautiful place for us to wrap up this part one of our conversation with Reverend Michael, is that when we can look at that hard thing or hard things that have happened, and go underneath that first initial blame or shame, right? The ego comes to the rescue, and we either go into deep shame, or we can't handle the shame, so the ego goes into blame, right? Victim, but then underneath it, it's like, okay, radical acceptance. This happened. This thing happened.
Yeah, and it's so powerful what Michael is speaking to. So I want to just kind of go a little deeper with it.
Yeah.
For someone who's watching right now. Michael's dropping a profound spiritual truth, and that is the difference between pain and suffering. And that suffering, the way I say it, is pain is in the body, suffering is in the mind. And what I mean by that is exactly what Michael said. I have a collection of stories about the pain, and to recognize that the story that I create about the pain is almost always me not wanting to experience the pain. And so, as Michael said, at least at this point in human evolution, pain is a part of our experience. It is the avoidance of pain that creates suffering. It creates long-term suffering. And in its simplest form, addiction is the avoidance of pain. Even if it's, as Michael said, it's chasing that high. And I love where he went. The high is actually the experience of our true nature. The first time I did ecstasy, which became my drug of choice for my last year of drinking and using, was I felt the experience of oneness, and then I chased it. Now, of course, that was chemically induced, so it's not like we're going to continue to have that same experience, but that was what I was really seeking. It wasn't the high, it was the experience of my true nature. And so suffering is the collection of stories that keep it alive, and in the avoidance of pain. Our culture, we could do a whole show on death and dying, but our culture pretty much avoids the experience of death. We say some really interesting things when someone dies, allowing ourselves to grieve, allowing ourselves to feel. David Hawkins, in his book, I believe it's Power versus Force, says that if we really allowed ourselves to grieve, that experience would dissipate after 20 minutes. Now, I don't know if that's true, but what I do know is that most people don't let themselves really grieve for 20 minutes. We go into it, and then we say things like pull ourselves together, that burying of that experience actually keeps it alive. And then we're in a story. This person shouldn't have died. Think about that for a moment. Scott, you've lived it, with the loss of your wife. It's the pain of it, and allowing ourselves to feel the pain is the actual freedom. It's the path to freedom. It's the avoidance of it through a story or a BS belief system around it that keeps it alive. And so when people say grief is a process, yeah, that could be. And then I become curious of what might happen if I simply allow myself to feel what I'm feeling without the story. So that's something that I offer. What would you be experiencing without the story right now?
Absolutely. I'm going to read comments. This is some great comments that have come in. But here's a fascinating little statistic from the people who study these things. 94% of the time that our reptile brain is triggered, it's from our own thoughts. Our ancestors were living in constant physical survival.
Right.
They really were in constant threat. We're not. We're very rarely in physical survival. But 94% of the time that our reptile brain gets triggered and we go into defending ourselves, it's from our own thoughts or our interpretations.
Yeah.
Why is TJ looking at me that way?
Right.
What do you mean by that? Right? How many times have you're neutral, and somebody that you're in a long-term relationship with, you just look at them. What is it now? We've all been there on both sides of that, right?
Yes. And it's the imagine not now.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so some beautiful comments. Mark writes, I just watched the film Unsinkable at the Illuminate Film Festival, which I was very involved in supporting. Nice. And it will help anyone in crisis to know that they're not alone. A fantastic film that's being released at the perfect time. Yes, thank you. Unsinkable. Beautiful. Kay writes, wow, suffering is the story we tell ourselves about our pain. Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael Beckwith. It's like we blame ourselves in nuanced ways, even, and then there are times we blame others for our pain. When pain is pain. It just is. It's our human experience. Like you just said, like Michael just said, we have to feel it. We have to mourn. We have to grieve. We have to pound the pillow. Maybe many times we feel it, but then as we feel it, we let it move and go through us. So thank you, Kay, for riffing on that. Stories allow us to avoid the pain. Yes, that's right. More comments coming in real quick.
I want to give you just this quote from Byron Katie that I posted yesterday. It's so timely, and I love this. I love her simplicity, and I mean that with utmost respect, because she distills it into a very simple and powerful statement. All suffering is either remembered or anticipated.
Yes.
So I'll say it one more time. All suffering is either remembered or anticipated. So as Scott said, it's not really, unless someone has a gun to my head, it's not usually, I would say 99.99999% of the time in our current culture, the suffering is a memory or an anticipation. And actually, when someone, a wise person, I don't remember who, once said to me, fear is really the imagined past being re-experienced. Right. So suffering is either, even the anticipation is in some way, oh, here we go again, right? Or I don't want this to happen again. Or why does this keep happening to me? That is true suffering. Again, it's the thought, it's the belief, it's the frequency. It's really something happening internally. And I love that study, Scott. That's fascinating to me about the brain.
So what's the opposite of that fear of the future or the remembering the pain of the past? Is absolute presence to it.
Absolute presence. Yeah.
And it's what every spiritual teacher that lives it is living. Yeah. When we're with someone, just that incredible presence. And sometimes we're present to suffering.
Yeah.
I think most of us, if we've been present to to a powerful moment, those powerful moments are moments of great joy, and sometimes the moments of great change. I've been with many people as they've died, including my animals and people, and it's a powerful time. And I was very fortunate with the death of my wife. Um, the way it played out, there was no time to search for a miracle cure. It was about, she's got 3 days to live approximately before her brain is going to have this thing happen and she's going to die. And so it was like just being fully present to these final days, became final hours, became final minutes, which became the final breath. And because I had a lot of support, I was very well supported, I was able to really be present for it. And I've often said, and it sometimes is surprising to people, but truly, honestly, her final breath was absolutely the greatest moment of my life so far.
Yeah.
Now I burst into tears, and there was the part of me that, oh my God, she's gone. But then there was also the greater part of me that experienced the beauty of her transition. And we all experienced it, we all felt it. And it was incredible. I mean, it was really, really beautiful. And because I had the support to be fully present to this powerful moment, it didn't get lost in the pain. And I'm really grateful for that. Really grateful that I had the right support to really kind of take that ride with her in a sense. We all took that ride with her to a degree. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're speaking. I mean, that's so beautiful, right? Because you weren't going into the suffering, the story, this should or shouldn't be happening, or am I doing this the right way? Or what if there is a miracle cure, and all those things that the mind wants to do, and it has a place, right? This is not about getting rid of the ego. And then there's these moments of surrender where you say, oh, we have 72 hours here. What are we going to do with this? And how do we be present? I'm reminded, I heard a speaker once who worked many years in hospice, and her talk title was "What Death Teaches Us About Life." And that title is so powerful because, being really present with someone, and that's really, it kind of comes full circle to our question about how to be present with someone in an addiction, whether it's your son or a loved one. It's really presence. Am I being present with, because I'm present for someone's suffering, as you said, Scott, because addiction is suffering. It's not pain. I mean, it can be pain, but it's also almost always suffering. And what we mean by that is how we laid that out. This shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't be an addict. I'm a bad person. My son shouldn't be doing this, etc. That's the suffering. And when I can be a witness to that from a place of ultimate space and presence, a friend of mine said, this thing about holding space, that just gets overused. And so I want to clarify what I mean. It's what Scott just said. When I'm fully present, and I'm not, as Byron Katie said, I'm not in the anticipation or the regret, that's a paraphrase, but when I'm fully present with someone and looking for the divine opportunity in this moment, that is holding the space. And then something miraculous occurs that has nothing to do with my plan or my scheme or my strategy.
Ooh, our mother, Rolanda, who had written earlier about her son, thanks us. And she says, connection is so important to human beings. But my son says, I'm not running from any pain. I have no pain. But he's deep in addiction. He has pain, but he won't see it.
Yeah, I've worked with clients. It's interesting you're saying this, Rhonda, because earlier I thought, gosh, I remember I've worked with clients that say, I don't have shame. I don't have trauma. I'm not running from anything. I like getting high, and meeting them where they're at. So I would, this is what I have done is, what is it about getting high that's so wonderful for you? Let's talk about that. And really almost from a place of enthusiasm, right? Because in conscious recovery, we don't call it a coping mechanism. We call it a brilliant strategy. I have a very quick, we can get into this at another time, but it's the 4 steps to personal freedom. And it starts with, really being grateful for the strategy. And that goes against so much of the conditioning. We've been taught that addiction is bad. We might even be taught that the person is bad, even using these terms like addict. I was reflecting on, I don't think anyone would say, hello, my name is Susan and I am cancer. We wouldn't do that to someone. Right. And so there's been an evolution happening. And I understand the importance of that historically. We're in a new time, right? And so starting with gratitude, I will encourage a client to say, thank you, heroin. You have been so wonderful to me. Thank you. Thank you. You saved my life. Ooh, I love you. I love the experience. And then we go into all the ways that it has served them, starting with that. And then ask, in what ways has it not served you? And then what do you truly desire? Because again, Rhonda said it, we all desire connection, and there might be a false sense of connection that is achieved through the high. So, we talk about meeting people where they're at, but I think sometimes it's like, I'm going to meet them where they're at so I can get them to do what I want them to do, or to see it the way I want them to. Really, to be present and invite the question, why do you love it so much? Let's talk about that. And again, so much compassion for mothers and fathers going through this. I understand the depth of the pain and the frustration and the like, I have to do something. What if my child dies? And that I hold that and I honor that. And that's a whole other level of suffering that can happen. I need to do something so my person doesn't die. And I honor that and hold that.
There's some really wonderful comments that have come into our Zoom room. Kay writes, I love holding space. Thank you, TJ. I feel its beauty and benefit. I've been in tune to that since massage therapy school and learning of energy work and in our field in the 90s. And Mark wrote, kind of in response to my story about my wife, when my father died when I was 14, I experienced his complete release into the light. As a Hungarian Catholic kid, it was not easy to understand. And since I wasn't crying and in grief, my family looked at me like I was cold, but I felt his liberation. It is true. There is this beautiful liberation. And Charlotte writes, I wonder about that too. I like to believe that as we leave this realm, others are waiting to embrace us in the spirit world. Now, I've done several shows on death and dying. I had a Sacred Sunday show with Daniel Brinkley a few weeks ago where we talked about that. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I've done a lot of work as a television producer on near-death experience documentaries. I've worked with the leading researchers on near-death experiences. And I want to say I've never heard a single near-death experience story that was scary. The experiences really vary. Some people see archetypal figures, Jesus, Mary. Some people see deceased relatives. Some people see the big golden light. But everyone reports some sort of experience of love, just unconditional love and safety and beauty. And so although the experiences vary, there is always like this field of love, a field of energy that's very, very loving. So just kind of mention that briefly. TJ, thank you so much. How do people get more TJ?
TJwoodward.com, or if you want to know about conscious recovery, it's consciousrecovery.com. And I'm really excited about part 2. I really want to hear more of what Michael Beckwith has to say, always, as a really powerful, one of the most dynamic spiritual teachers of our time.
So I'm going to go to tjwoodward.com. Just to remind people, there he is. Look at that good-looking guy. tjwoodward.com, and that's where you can learn about Conscious Being, his other book, Conscious Recovery, and the new one coming, Conscious Creation. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you.
A little sneak preview. What's interesting about the second part of my interview with Reverend Michael, as fate had it, we had a Zoom session scheduled, and he had just gotten off the phone with the police because his other home had been burglarized 2 nights in a row.
Wow.
And so he was still dealing with some very human stuff. And so we get to hear how Reverend Michael as a positive role model, deals with very human stuff. The anger, the frustration, the inconvenience of having someone breaking into his home, not once, but 2 nights in a row.
Wow.
And he lost some precious items, and he had issues and stuff around that. So we will see how Michael deals with that.
I look forward to that.
Yeah. So we will schedule, I'll work with TJ. We'll schedule a part 2 probably in about 3 or 4 weeks. Thank you, TJ, for your
Thank you,
time.
Scott.
Love you so much.
Love you too. I'm very honored.
Thank you, everybody. And a wonderful way to say thank you is to share this. Share this video with your friends out on Facebook so we can meet new people. And for anybody watching the replay, thank you for watching. And I always like to close my Sacred Sunday show by saying, we can make any day or any moment sacred by slowing down and seeing the divinity, seeing the sacred in that other person, in the situation, most of all in ourselves. Thank you, TJ. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.